So talking about cutting corners today, I just want to reflect again on this idea of the corner and the importance of the corner as we talked about earlier. The corner is where two edges meet. If you think about even a piece of paper, the corner is the most external part of the piece of paper, where the edges meet. But when we start talking about something like a building, we can see how important the corners are. Now, when we talk about corners in the teachings of the church, Swedenborg talks about them, and he uses this word ultimates. Ultimates. And what he means by that is the most external expression of something, or the most external form of something. So you think about our religion, for example. The most external expression of our religion is, what would you say? Meeting together for worship, for example. Anything we do physically that our religion stirs us to do. This is what Swedenborg refers to as ultimates. These are the corners of our religion. Now, I want to go and talk about another passage before I talk about this one from first book of Samuel. And it's book of Numbers, where the children of Israel are given a command to create these. Does anybody know what this is? Yes. Used for what in particular?
In a synagogue, I think the rabbi used to cover it.
In fact, if you go to a synagogue, everybody, all the men certainly will use a prayer shawl like this, and they will often have it over their heads. And there's reference in particular to the tassels in the book of Numbers, chapter 15. So there's a story of a man who is caught gathering sticks on a Sabbath day. And the people really don't know what to do with him. So they take hold of him and they take him to Moses. And Moses consults the Lord. And the Lord says, well, yes, he must be put to death. It's quite a harsh punishment for something as simple as gathering sticks, it looks in our eyes. He's commanded in actual fact to be stoned. But the story's been put in there for a very particular reason. If you look at before that story takes place, there is a command about unintentional sins and intentional sins. When someone sins unintentionally, there is a way and a means of reconciling that sin, that problem. But where someone sins intentionally, that is, they know that something is wrong, but they do it anyway, there's no coming back from it. Okay, there's no restitution that can be made for that. And so this story of this man gathering sticks is really, I think, intended as illustration of that principle. Here is someone who knew he should not be doing anything on the Sabbath. He is caught doing something on the Sabbath, and the principle is that he needs to be stoned. What the chapter then goes on to describe is the tassels on the corners or the edges of the prayer shawl. And this is what we read in the book of Numbers about these corners. It says, "Tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels of the corners, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined." Now, the word for corner that's used in this passage is an interesting one, because it means corner, but it also means edge, and it means wings. The wings of a bird, it's the same word is used. And the intention of the wings of a bird are not so much flight as protection. So you might know of a number of passages, and I found several even just in the Psalms, where it says things like, "Hide me under the shadow of your wings." Several places that it refers to this sort of idea in the scriptures, even in the New Testament also. So the corner, the edge of the garment, the wings are a protection. That's what's intended there. So the tassels on the corner of the garment are protection in remembering spiritual principles. And the blue thread that goes through the tassels is a reminder that these are divine principles that flow through into these very external parts of the commandments. And what I see here, if we look at that Numbers chapter 15 and take it as a whole, the protection is in this, that where you have an idea of something you want to do, if you are able to recall the spiritual teaching and the religious principle that covers that, it becomes a protection if you heed it. It pulls you back from the edge of doing something that could potentially be harmful. That's the protection. And so the prayer shawl with the tassels is just a reminder to, in every situation you're in, find the spiritual principle that applies, and even if you don't feel like it, stick to the spiritual principle. That's the protection. And it's especially important when we don't feel like it, because it's the Lord calling us back from something that's potentially harmful. The New Church author William Bruce wrote this, and I found this quite useful. Even when the natural person is still rebellious and unwilling to yield submission to the rule of the spiritual, there may be partial, if not entire, control acquired over the natural person. If the spiritual person cannot bring the whole of the natural under his order, he may at least lay a hold of his mantle, the edge, and retain the skirt of it in his hand. Now he's talking about the passage from first book of Samuel. This instance where David goes into the cave to relieve himself, and there he is in the midst of David and his warriors, and he is in grave danger without realizing it. David, rather than taking the opportunity of seizing the throne by killing Saul in that moment, merely cuts off the corner of his garment, and it's the same word in the Hebrew as we've just looked at in Numbers. He cuts off the corner. It's the ultimates, the lowest principles that religion and spirituality calls us to. So Saul has lost control of it. David now has control. David represents spiritual principles. Saul represents merely natural, unregenerate ones. And the cave, the darkness of the cave, we can just think of temptation. See, if we look at the story and the way it's unfolding, Saul, as the natural, hates David, who represents the spiritual principle, a higher principle. And so often I see this, that people who are naturally focused do not like spiritual principles, because it seems to them that if we adhere to spiritual principles, real spiritual principles, they're going to lose something, lose their freedom, even lose their life. Natural principles look at spiritual ones and think, oh, they're going to take over, and I won't be able to do what I wanted to do anymore. And so the natural seeks to destroy what is spiritual, but it's not true the other way around. Spiritual principles don't hate natural ones. In the same way, David did not hate Saul. In fact, the spiritual is focused on making the natural better, if at all possible. So when we meet temptation, what is natural will always lose control. It will always seek to follow its own desires, but what is spiritual focuses on the rule of divine law. It focuses on what it must do. You think about the way David processed that occurrence. He did not strike down Saul because Saul was the Lord's anointed. He had to leave Saul alone. And he recognized that what was going to happen was Saul would bring about his own downfall. And that's what the natural does. So again, William Bruce, about this occurrence, he says, those who are spiritually minded are not exempt from all the feelings and actions that originate in human infirmity. They will, however, be exempt in the degree that the spiritual in them has obtained dominion over the natural. Those who are born again receive a new nature, and it is impossible for any who have thus become new creatures deliberately to commit deeds that are characteristic of the old person, of the world and the flesh. So I just want to put all of this together, just to finish off. When you go about your life in the next week, you will very likely meet situations that you react against. Before you react, stop and think, what are the spiritual principles that apply here? What is the spiritual principle that I should focus on? Because if we can do that, that acts as a protection for us. So even though we've got all of this stuff going on in our head about, he, she did me wrong, I deserve this, all that stuff that goes on, if we can hold on to it and allow the spiritual principle to lead the action that we actually enact, the thing we actually do, then there is the Lord flowing down into our lives. And there is the Lord, that's the blue thread in the tassel, actually determining our life and what it looks like. So we kind of hold on to the desires in our hearts, the things that the way we react to a situation, but stop and think and allow the spiritual principle to lead. There is the protection for us. That's the corner that we need to seek.